The day I became the most hated man in Lakeside Meadows was the same day I realized I could become the most powerful. It all started when I was fined $500 for fishing with my daughter, Emily, who was grieving the loss of her mother. Karen Bennett, the HOA president, was the one who issued the fine. Not only did she make our difficult time even harder, but she also seemed completely oblivious to the pain we were enduring. I remember that morning so clearly. The sun was shining, and Emily and I were sitting on a small dock by the lake. It was the one place where we could escape the sadness and try to heal. But then, out of nowhere, a sharp voice cut through the silence. Karen walked up, holding a tablet in her hand, and without even acknowledging who I was, she began accusing us of breaking the rules. When she told me that fishing was a violation, I couldn't stay calm any longer. Emily stood next to me, her eyes welling up with tears, feeling the sting of being treated this way. I knew right then and there that I couldn't stay silent. In life, there are moments when you have to stand up for what matters, and I wasn't going to let Karen keep pushing us around. The fine was just the beginning. After the incident with Karen Bennett at the lake, I felt like a storm had been unleashed. I could still see Emily's face, the hurt in her eyes as she tried to understand why someone would punish us for something so simple, something we had done together to heal. But what hurt more than the fine itself was Karen's attitude. Cold, dismissive, as if we were nothing more than another annoyance she had to deal with. She had no idea who we were, no idea what we were going through. And that's when I realized this was more than just a misunderstanding about fishing. It was about power, control, and the kind of people who could manipulate situations to their own advantage. I spent that evening racking my brain, wondering if there was more to this than just a neighborhood HOA regulation. Sure, I had heard whispers about Karen being strict as the president of the HOA, but I never imagined it would go this far. I decided to dig deeper. What I found shocked me, but it also lit a fire in me I hadn't realized was still burning. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using her position to control the entire community. She had been the president of the HOA for years, and from what I could gather, she was ruthless. She seemed to know everything about everyone in the neighborhood, and the more I looked into her, the more I realized how much power she had, and how much she was willing to abuse it. I started going through the public records, pulling up information about the HOA's finances, looking for any signs of mismanagement or corruption. It didn't take long to see a pattern. Karen had been quietly acquiring properties in Lakeside Meadows, buying them up when homeowners were forced to sell due to escalating fines and violations. The more I looked, the clearer it became. She wasn't just running the HOA for the benefit of the residents. She was using it to line her own pockets, to build her empire while the rest of us struggled to keep up with her ever-changing rules and fees. That's when I realized the lake wasn't just a community amenity to her, it was the next step in her real estate plan. I started digging into the lake's ownership, and what I uncovered made my blood run cold. The lake was a common property amenity, part of the original development plan for the community. But the more I learned, the more I saw that Karen had plans to privatize it, to sell off parts of it to developers and build luxury homes along the shoreline. The fishing ban, the sudden push for lake improvements, it was all part of her scheme to reduce access and increase her own profit margins. I couldn't let that happen. Not to Emily, not to me, and not to the people in this community who had no idea what was really going on. But to fight back, I needed information, allies, and a plan. I reached out to Merrick Henderson, a retired attorney who lived a few doors down from me. I had overheard him mention Karen in passing once, and when I told him about the fine and the fishing ban, his reaction was immediate. He knew exactly who Karen was and what she had been doing to this community for years. "You've met our neighborhood dictator," he said with a grimace. "Let me guess, she fined you for something trivial and used some obscure regulation to back it up?" Merrick became my first ally, but I knew I needed more. Over the next few days, I met with several other residents who had been quietly suffering under Karen's regime. Samuel Washington, a retired bank owner, was another key figure in my plan. He had been tracking Karen's actions for years, compiling a database of violations, fines, and suspicious transactions that painted a clear picture of her manipulation. Together, we started organizing. We met secretly, sharing our stories, gathering evidence and talking about ways to push back. We all had the same goal, to expose Karen and take back control of our community. But as I dug deeper into Karen's personal life, I began to realize that she wasn't just an entitled, manipulative HOA president. She was in deep financial trouble. Her real estate company, Wellington Properties, was highly leveraged, and she had been taking out lines of credit to fund her lavish lifestyle and her real estate acquisitions. The more I looked into it, the more I saw that she was desperate. The lake development plan wasn't just an opportunity for her to profit. It was her last chance to avoid financial ruin. That's when I made my move. With the information I had gathered, I was in a position to buy the lake from Meridian Development Corporation, the original developers of the community. They were struggling financially, desperate to sell off assets. And I knew that if I could get my hands on the lake, I could stop Karen in her tracks. I had the capital to make an immediate all-cash offer, and I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through my fingers. As I worked with Samuel, Merrick, and our growing network of residents, the pressure started to mount on Karen. The fines, the harassment, the manipulation, it was all backfiring. More and more people were starting to question her leadership, and I could see the cracks in her armor. She was getting desperate, making mistakes, and taking risks that would ultimately cost her everything. But the real victory would come when I could finally reveal the truth to the entire community, to expose Karen for what she truly was, a fraud, a manipulator, and someone who was willing to destroy our community for her own gain. I had no idea how far I was willing to go to stop her, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to stop until she was out of our lives for good. And it all started with the lake. As the days passed, I could feel the tension rising in our little community. The more I dug into Karen Bennett's reign over Lakeside Meadows, the more I uncovered about her manipulative tactics. It wasn't just about the fishing ban anymore. It was about something much bigger. Karen wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was using those rules to control everything, to drive out anyone she saw as an obstacle to her ultimate goal: complete ownership of the lake and its surrounding properties. What I had initially dismissed as a petty neighborhood dispute had quickly transformed into a full-blown battle over power, wealth, and control. The deeper I got, the more my blood began to boil. Karen had been in charge of the HOA for nearly a decade, and in that time, she had built an empire of real estate holdings and properties, many of which had been acquired through her manipulation of the HOA's rules. She wasn't just targeting me. She had been squeezing out longtime residents with excessive fines, selective rule enforcement, and blatant intimidation. The fishing ban was just a small piece of the puzzle, but what she didn't know was that I wasn't going to back down, not after everything I had already lost. I started to talk to more people in the neighborhood. I reached out to Samuel Washington, the retired banker I had met earlier. Samuel was a wealth of information, and what he shared with me only confirmed my suspicions. Over the years, Karen had used her position to push homeowners into selling their properties. The violations and fines were never random. They were part of a carefully crafted plan to drive down property values, forcing owners to sell at a loss. Those properties, once sold for pennies on the dollar, were quickly scooped up by shell companies with connections to Karen's real estate business. It was a strategy as cold and calculated as anything I had ever seen. But the lake, that was the crown jewel. The lake was more than just a scenic spot in the middle of the community. It was a prime piece of real estate. Karen had long known that the development rights to the lake were set to expire, and she had plans to buy it up, privatize it, and build luxury homes along the shoreline. The more I learned, the more I realized just how far Karen was willing to go to make this dream a reality. It wasn't just about the lake's potential for profit. It was about her control over the community's future. She was building an empire, and she didn't care who she had to crush to get there. I knew I had to act fast. With Merrick's help, I began to research the ownership of the lake, and what I found only fueled my determination. The lake wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It was a piece of land leased by Meridian Development Corporation, the original developers of Lakeside Meadows. But the lease was set to expire soon, and if no one stepped up, the lake could be sold to the highest bidder. And Karen was already in talks with Meridian to purchase the lake, using her position as HOA president to secure a deal that would give her sole control. It was a brilliant move, if you looked at it from her perspective, but it was also a deeply unethical one. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the documents I had gathered, something clicked. I had the resources, I had the connections. I could buy the lake from Meridian just before Karen could secure the deal for herself. The idea of being able to block her, to take away her prized possession, gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in months. This wasn't just about fighting for Emily's right to fish. This was about taking back control from someone who had abused their power for far too long. But there was a catch. I couldn't do it alone. I needed support from the community. Merrick had already warned me that going head-to-head with Karen would be risky. She had her claws in nearly every aspect of the neighborhood, and the resistance would come with consequences. That's when Samuel stepped in, offering his help in ways I hadn't expected. Samuel had been tracking Karen's financial history for years, and he had compiled a database of violations and suspicious activities. With his help, I started to piece together the full extent of Karen's manipulation. But we couldn't stop there. We needed to get the community involved. We needed to show the residents of Lakeside Meadows what was really happening behind closed doors. I started reaching out to other homeowners who had been hurt by Karen's actions. Slowly but surely, I built a network of allies. There were the Johnsons, who had been fined for something as trivial as trimming their hedge the wrong way. There was Maria Gonzalez, whose kids had been banned from the community pool for excessive noise, even though no one else had been reprimanded for similar behavior. Each story was another piece of evidence against Karen's leadership, and every person I spoke to made me more determined to stop her. Together, we formed a small but growing resistance, sharing our stories and planning our next moves. By the time I was ready to make my offer to Meridian, I had enough information to expose Karen for what she really was, a predator preying on her own neighbors for profit. I used my connections with former business colleagues to arrange a discreet meeting with Meridian's executive team. They were desperate to unload the lake property, and I had the cash to make an all-cash offer. I knew that if I moved quickly, I could beat Karen to the punch and take control of the very thing she had been coveting. When I finally signed the papers, I felt a rush of victory, but it wasn't over yet. The real battle was just beginning. I knew Karen wouldn't back down easily, and the community still didn't know what had really been going on. But I was ready to fight. I had my plan, my allies, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side, and that truth would be my weapon. When I finally managed to secure the lake, it felt like a monumental victory, but I knew it was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The feeling of having one-upped Karen Bennett and taken control of the very property she had been scheming to acquire for years was exhilarating, but I couldn't afford to get complacent. The people of Lakeside Meadows deserved to know the truth about what had been happening behind closed doors. They needed to see Karen for what she truly was. A manipulative, self-serving individual who had been using the HOA as her personal tool for power and profit. At first, I kept the news of my purchase under wraps, careful to avoid alerting Karen to what was coming. I knew she would try to fight back in any way she could, and I needed to be prepared for whatever she threw my way. But I also knew that this was a critical moment, not just for me, but for the entire community. The residents had suffered for so long under Karen's leadership, and now they had the chance to take back what had been taken from them. I couldn't let that opportunity slip by. With Merrick and Samuel's help, we began to build our case against Karen, compiling all the evidence we had gathered over the past few weeks. The lake wasn't just an asset, it was a symbol of the community's rights, a place that belonged to all of us, not just to one person with a vested interest in turning it into a profit machine. We organized meetings with the residents who had joined our cause, quietly discussing how we could move forward and how we could expose Karen's manipulation without giving her the chance to retaliate too quickly. Meanwhile, Karen had no idea what was coming. She continued her usual antics, hosting more HOA meetings, trying to push through her so-called improvements to the lake. But her confidence was waning. I could tell she knew something was up. The subtle signs were there. More people were starting to question her decisions, and even some of her staunchest supporters were beginning to back off. The whispers were growing louder, but Karen, oblivious to the storm that was building against her, carried on as if nothing had changed. It wasn't long before I received the call from Robert Chen, the real estate broker who had helped me arrange the purchase of the lake. "I have something you need to hear," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Karen's been talking to Meridian Development again. She's trying to get them to reverse the sale to you." My heart sank, but I didn't panic. This was exactly what I had expected. Karen would never give up without a fight. The question was, how far was she willing to go? I spent the next few days preparing myself for her next move. I knew she would use her influence with the local government and the HOA board to try to get the sale overturned, and I had no intention of letting that happen. I reached out to my attorney to start working on a plan to block any legal challenges Karen might throw my way. Meanwhile, I gathered more evidence of her misdeeds, financial irregularities, property records, and even testimonials from residents who had been harassed or intimidated by her over the years. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just abusing her position for personal gain. She was using the entire HOA as her personal tool to manipulate and control the community. The breaking point came when Karen scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she called critical improvements to the lake. She was still pushing her agenda, despite the fact that the lake no longer belonged to the HOA. The meeting was supposed to be a formality, a way for her to rally support for her cause. But it was clear that her days of controlling the community were numbered. As soon as the meeting began, Karen launched into her usual pitch, outlining her plans to build luxury homes along the shoreline, reducing the lake's public access in the process. She even had architectural renderings prepared, showcasing the vision she had for the future of lakeside meadows. The room was silent as she spoke, her words flowing smoothly, almost too smoothly. But something had shifted. There was a sense of unease in the air, an undercurrent of doubt that hadn't been there before. I watched as a few residents in the back whispered among themselves, and then one by one, they began to speak up. First, it was Samuel, who had long been critical of Karen's leadership. Then another longtime resident, Safara Dusklin, stood up, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger as she spoke. "I've been on this board for 3 years," she said, her eyes locked on Karen. "And I've watched as you've manipulated the rules, made decisions that only benefit your friends, and used this community to fuel your own real estate business. We need to talk about the truth here, Karen. We need to face the reality of what's been happening behind closed doors." The room erupted in murmurs. For the first time, Karen was losing control. People were starting to question her, and it was clear she didn't know how to handle it. The support she had once commanded so effortlessly was slipping away. For a brief moment, I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew that the walls were closing in, but Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. As soon as the meeting ended, she rushed out of the room, calling an emergency meeting with the HOA board to discuss damage control. But the damage had already been done. The residents were beginning to see Karen for who she truly was, and there was no going back. I knew it was time to make my move. As Karen scrambled to maintain her grip on the community, I quietly revealed myself as the new owner of the lake. I didn't announce it in some grand, dramatic fashion. I didn't need to. I simply showed up at the next HOA meeting with the deed to the lake in hand, ready to expose Karen for all her lies. It was time to take back control, to stop the manipulation, and to remind everyone that the lake belonged to the community, not to one person, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The day I revealed myself as the new owner of the lake was the day everything changed. Karen Bennett had always held power in Lakeside Meadows, controlling the residents with her manipulative tactics, using the HOA to her advantage, and exploiting every opportunity to line her pockets. She had almost succeeded in securing the lake for herself, planning to turn it into a luxury development that would drastically reduce public access and make her even wealthier. But when I stepped forward, holding the deed to the lake in my hands, it felt like a seismic shift. I could feel the weight of the moment when I took back control of not just the lake, but the community as a whole. I had been quietly gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing for this moment for weeks. Now that the deed was mine, it was time to expose Karen and her schemes to everyone. I could see the shock on the faces of the residents as they realized what had happened. The whispers grew louder, and the unease in the room was palpable. Karen's confident facade, which had once dominated every HOA meeting, began to crack. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to gauge how the community was reacting. She had been so certain that her plans for the lake were unstoppable, but now the rug had been pulled out from under her. I knew Karen would fight back. She had a long history of using her influence to get what she wanted, and I was sure she wouldn't let go of the lake without a fight. But I also knew that the tide had turned. More and more people in the community were starting to see her for who she truly was. For the first time, the residents of Lakeside Meadows weren't just following Karen's orders. They were beginning to question her, to see the cracks in her leadership, the stories we had shared, the evidence we had gathered. It was all coming together. Karen's manipulation was no longer a secret. I could feel the anger rising in me as I looked around the room. Karen had played her games for too long, using her position to bully and intimidate anyone who dared to stand up to her. She had used the HOA as a tool for her own gain, bending the rules to suit her needs and disregarding anyone who didn't fit into her vision of the perfect community. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. This time, it wasn't just about me and Emily. It was about the entire community. Karen's next move came quickly, as I had anticipated. She tried to rally the board members to challenge the sale, arguing that the lake should remain under the control of the HOA. But she wasn't prepared for the response. Several residents who had once supported her now spoke out against her. It started with Samuel Washington, a man who had suffered under her regime for years. He was one of the first to stand up, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, you've been using the HOA to push your own real estate agenda for too long," he said. "You've taken advantage of the residents here, and we're not going to let you do it anymore." His words were powerful, and they struck a chord with the others in the room. One by one, other residents stood up, sharing their own stories of being targeted by Karen's selective enforcement of rules. Maria Gonzalez, who had been fined for something as trivial as a lawn ornament, spoke up next. Then Diana Winters, who had been harassed for the color of her mailbox. The room filled with voices, all pointing to the same conclusion. Karen Bennett had used her power to control the community for her own benefit, and now it was time for that to end. I could see Karen's composure beginning to crack. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, but now it was slipping through her fingers. She tried to deflect, to redirect the conversation, but the more she spoke, the more the cracks in her story became apparent. The residents were no longer afraid of her. They were no longer intimidated by her position. The truth was out, and they weren't going to let her continue manipulating them. But Karen wasn't ready to give up just yet. She made a last-ditch effort to regain control, calling for a vote to reverse the sale of the lake. She argued that the HOA had the right to maintain control of the lake for the community's benefit. But by now, the residents had had enough. The vote was almost unanimous in favor of keeping the lake under my ownership. The final blow came when Sapphira Duskland, a longtime board member, spoke up and called for an audit of the HOA's finances. "We've seen enough," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "It's time for a change." With the vote secured, Karen's position as HOA president became increasingly untenable. She tried to save face, claiming that she had the community's best interests at heart, but no one was buying it anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal battles as Karen attempted to cling to her power, but the damage had been done. Her reputation had been shattered, and her grip on the community had slipped away. As the pressure mounted, Karen resorted to even more desperate measures. She attempted to bribe Merrick with promises of a cushy position on the new HOA board. But he had recorded the conversation, and it was just the final piece of evidence we needed to expose her for good. The scandal spread quickly through the community, and within days, Karen's real estate company was under investigation for unethical practices. She had underestimated the power of a community coming together, and now she was paying the price. In the end, Karen resigned in disgrace, and the new HOA leadership, led by Sapphira Duskland, was elected. The lake was officially renamed Rachel's Lake in honor of my late wife, and I transferred ownership to a newly established community trust, ensuring that the lake would remain accessible to all residents for generations to come. What had started as a battle over fishing rights had turned into a victory not just for me, but for the entire community. We had taken back control of our neighborhood, and we had done it together. As I sat by the lake that evening, watching the sunset reflect on the water, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Emily was beside me, a small smile on her face. For the first time in a long while, we were truly home. As the days passed after Karen Bennett's resignation, the atmosphere in Lakeside Meadows began to shift. The community, which had once felt fractured and divided under her leadership, started to come together. People who had kept their heads down for years, afraid to speak out, were now finding their voices. They were looking at the lake, Rachel's Lake, as I had named it, and seeing it not just as a body of water, but as a symbol of the victory we had achieved together. The lake had always been more than a place for fishing. It had been the heart of our neighborhood, a peaceful refuge that Karen had tried to control for her own gain. Now it was a place where we could all gather, free from the grip of manipulation and greed. Karen's final attempt to hold on to her power had been a last-ditch effort that failed miserably. She had tried to rally her supporters, launch a smear campaign, and even manipulate local government officials. But all of her efforts only exposed her true nature. She was a woman desperate to hold on to a system that had served her well for far too long, using fear and intimidation to maintain control. But as I stood there by the lake, watching children laughing and fishing, I realized that the real power lay not in the hands of someone like Karen, but in the unity of the community. The residents of Lakeside Meadows had finally seen through her facade. With Karen out of the picture, it was time to rebuild. Not just the lake, but the community as a whole. The first step was to hold a community meeting, an open and transparent gathering where every resident was invited to share their thoughts, concerns, and hopes for the future. It was crucial that we set the tone early on, showing that we were no longer going to be silenced or manipulated by anyone. I wanted to make it clear that this was a fresh start for all of us. The days of backroom deals and one person making all the decisions were over. The meeting was held in the newly renovated community center, a large open space with windows that let in the sunlight and a view of the lake. As the residents gathered, I could feel a sense of anticipation in the air. People were eager to speak, eager to finally be heard. I stood at the front of the room, my heart pounding, knowing this was the beginning of something new for all of us. The room was filled with familiar faces, some I had known for years and others who had kept to themselves. But they all shared one thing in common. They were ready for change. I opened the meeting by acknowledging the struggles we had all faced under Karen's rule. I didn't shy away from the reality of what had happened. We had been manipulated, we had been taken advantage of, and we had been made to feel like outsiders in our own community. But now things were different. Now we had control, and we had the opportunity to make the changes that mattered to us. As I spoke, I could see the residents nodding, some of them visibly relieved that someone was finally speaking the truth. I talked about the lake, about how it wasn't just a place for fishing, but a place for all of us to connect. It belonged to everyone, not just the privileged few who could buy their way into the community. I promised that the lake would remain a public resource, a place where families could come together, where children could learn about nature, and where we could all find peace. The residents began to speak up, sharing their own stories of how they had been treated under Karen's rule. Maria Gonzalez spoke about the time her family had been fined for a trivial violation. It was never about the rules, she said, her voice shaking. It was about control. She wanted to break us, make us feel like we didn't belong. The room grew silent as others shared similar experiences, stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and being singled out for speaking out. It was clear that Karen's reign had left deep scars on the community, but now we were facing those scars together, ready to heal. As the meeting went on, I could see the shift in the room. The anger and frustration that had been building for so long began to transform into hope. People were no longer just angry, they were determined to rebuild. We began to discuss concrete plans for the future, plans for how we could make the community more inclusive, how we could ensure that the HOA would never again become a tool for one person's personal gain. We talked about the need for term limits on the HOA board, for transparent voting processes, and for regular audits of HOA finances. The conversation was full of ideas, full of passion, and full of the kind of energy I hadn't seen in this community since I moved in. The most powerful moment of the meeting came when Safira Duskland, one of the residents who had stood up to Karen at the final HOA meeting, spoke. "I've lived here for years, And I've seen this place go from a close-knit community to something fractured and divided, she said, her voice steady. But what I see now is the beginning of something better. We have a chance to fix what's broken, to rebuild what Karen tore down, and we're going to do it together. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of unity in Lakeside Meadows. As the meeting came to a close, we agreed on the next steps: electing a new, more transparent HOA board, creating a community trust for the lake to ensure it remained in the hands of the people, and forming a committee to review the HOA's bylaws and regulations to make sure they served everyone, not just a select few. We were no longer just residents, we were a community, and we were taking back control. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, of course, and there would still be people who resisted change. But as I stood by the lake that evening, watching the sunset reflect off the water, I knew that we had turned a corner. The darkness of Karen's influence was finally behind us, and in its place there was light. The lake was more than just water. It was a symbol of our strength, our resilience, and our commitment to building a better future together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the right path. As the days turned into weeks after Karen's resignation, the full weight of the changes we had set into motion began to sink in. Lakeside Meadows was starting to feel like a community again, not a battleground where every interaction was tainted by fear and suspicion. People who had been silenced for so long were now speaking out, sharing their ideas and dreams for a better neighborhood. The healing process wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about rebuilding trust, about reestablishing the sense of belonging that had been taken away by Karen's manipulation. Our first big step was to reform the HOA. The community trust for the lake was officially established, ensuring that it would never again fall into the hands of someone like Karen. But there was more work to be done. We needed to change the way the entire neighborhood operated. I had no illusions about the challenges ahead. Even though Karen had lost her grip on power, there were still many in the community who were resistant to change, who had been complicit in her reign or were simply too set in their ways to embrace something new. I spent the next few weeks working closely with Samuel, Merrick, and the other leaders of our coalition, organizing and planning our next moves. We started by focusing on the most immediate issues: the restructuring of the HOA and ensuring that no one could use it as a tool for personal gain again. It was important that we not only removed Karen from power, but also created a system that would prevent anyone from abusing their position in the future. We proposed term limits for board members, set up transparent voting procedures, and introduced regular audits of the HOA's finances. No longer would the board be able to make decisions in secrecy, hiding behind vague rules and regulations. The hardest part was getting the community to fully buy into these changes. There were still skeptics, people who weren't sure whether the new system would work or whether we could actually make things better. Some were worried that we were just replacing one form of control with another. But the more we talked, the more we shared our vision for the future, the more people began to see what we were building. The truth was, we weren't just trying to undo the damage Karen had done. We were trying to create something better, something that would last. And the more we opened the conversation, the more we realized just how much support we had from the people who had been too afraid to speak up before. The first real victory came when the new HOA board was elected. This wasn't just about replacing Karen. It was about giving power back to the people who had been overlooked for too long. When Sapphira Dusklin was elected as the new HOA president, it felt like a true turning point. Sapphira had been one of the first to stand up to Karen, and her leadership was exactly what the community needed. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was someone who genuinely cared about making Lakeside Meadows a better place. She was a voice for the people, not the power players. Together with the new board members, she set to work implementing the changes we had all fought for. The changes weren't immediate. There were hurdles, of course, resistance from some longtime residents who had been too comfortable with the old ways, and skepticism from others who worried about how quickly things were moving. But the momentum was on our side. The community trust for the lake was now fully operational, and for the first time in years, there were no hidden agendas. Everyone had a voice. For the first time, it felt like we were truly moving forward. But our work wasn't done. With the HOA restructured and the lake secure, it was time to focus on the heart of the community. We wanted to make Lakeside Meadows a place where families could truly thrive, where people could connect and create lasting memories without the constant fear of being penalized for the smallest infractions. We began organizing neighborhood events, fishing competitions, barbecues, and cleanup days. We wanted to bring people together, to rebuild the sense of community that had been shattered by Karen's reign. The lake, now officially known as Rachel's Lake, became a focal point for these efforts. It wasn't just a body of water, it had become a symbol of our resilience, of our ability to stand up to corruption and rebuild from the ground up. The fishing events were particularly meaningful to me. I'd never imagined that something as simple as fishing could bring people together in such a profound way. Watching families bond over fishing rods and tackle boxes, hearing the laughter of children running along the shore, I felt a deep sense of pride. This was what we had fought for. This was the future of Lakeside Meadows. But even as we made progress, there were reminders of the past. Karen's real estate company, now under investigation for her shady dealings, was slowly falling apart. The community's distrust of her was so deep that even when she tried to sell her home, she couldn't find a buyer. Her reputation had been completely destroyed, and it was a bitter but satisfying reminder of the consequences of her actions. In a strange way, it made me feel vindicated, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it proved that justice had been served. She had been brought down by her own greed and arrogance. One of the most rewarding parts of the entire experience was seeing the residents of Lakeside Meadows come together in a way I had never thought possible. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now taking ownership of their community. It was no longer just a place to live. It was a place to belong. And I realized, looking at the changes we had made, that we weren't just rebuilding a community. We were creating something new, something that would outlast Karen's reign and any future challenges we might face. The transformation wasn't just about property values or HOA rules. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully ours and ensuring that future generations would have a better, more inclusive community to call home. As Emily and I stood by the lake one evening, watching the sunset over the water, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The journey had been long, filled with hardships and setbacks, but in the end, it had been worth it. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were truly home. With the new leadership in place and the lake secured under community control, Lakeside Meadows began to flourish in ways I hadn't imagined. The changes we fought for were no longer just ideas, they were becoming a reality. What was once a place of division and fear, dominated by Karen's manipulation, had transformed into a vibrant, welcoming community. People who had once stayed silent now participated, voiced their concerns, and contributed to the future of the neighborhood. Our first big event, a community-wide fishing day at Rachel's Lake, brought families together like never before. Children laughed, parents shared stories, and for the first time in years, the sound of joy echoed through the neighborhood. It felt as if the healing process had truly begun, not just for Emily and me, but for everyone who had been touched by Karen's reign. Watching families reconnect, hearing people share their hopes for a better future, I knew that we had accomplished something far greater than I had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about defeating one woman, it was about building something new, something better. As I stood by the lake with Emily, I realized that we had reclaimed more than just property, we had reclaimed our community, a lesson from the fight against manipulation and corruption in the community. My story and the transformation of Lakeside Meadows is not just a battle to protect personal rights, but a valuable lesson about the power of unity and perseverance when facing manipulation and corruption. The first lesson I learned is never stay silent in the face of injustice. Karen Bennett used her position to manipulate, divide, and exploit people in our community. However, it was the silence and fear of those around her that allowed her to continue. When I decided to speak up and fight back, I realized that change begins with finding your voice, even when you feel like you're standing alone in the battle. The second lesson is the strength of a community. One person can change a few things, but it's the collective power of a community that can truly alter the course. While I began this fight as an individual, It was through the support of the residents, people willing to share their stories and stand together, that we built a strong network. In the end, it was the community that helped us overcome the challenges. Lastly, I learned that nothing is more valuable than fairness and integrity. We didn't just protect the lake, we defended the core values of a community where every person's voice and rights are respected. The fight wasn't just about defeating one villain, it was about creating a future where everyone has equal opportunity and fair treatment. Remember, no matter the challenge you face, never give up. Big changes start with small steps, with consistent actions, and most importantly, with coming together with like-minded individuals.